adaptive response. And also participating as an author in the current assessment by the IPCC, as well as the National Climate Assessment, looking at the chapter on multiple stressors, structural inequities, cascading failures, and complex systems, really weaving in a lot of the themes we'll be working with today.
Okay, thank you for that. Excited to have you today. Dr. Fang, if you would like to take the time to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Alicia. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Fang. I'm an energy advisor at USAID. I work in the Energy and Green Cities divisions at USAID and the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. Most of my work is really focused on the mitigation side, so I'm really curious to hear how Dr. Mach also deals with these issues, so I think we'll make a interesting panel. Currently, I manage most of USAID's urban transportation work. I work a lot with the Department of Energy National Labs, specifically the National Renewable Energy Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on electric vehicle energy efficiency work. And then I do a lot of work sort of on the urban transportation side, so looking at how cities in developing countries can increase access to equitable and clean transportation solutions. I joined the agency actually as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in 2019. In my past sort of academic research life, most of my work was focused on urban sustainability issues and co-benefits or air pollution co-benefits to climate change mitigation. So the first half of my dissertation focused on cities in India and China, and to look at how climate change solutions could help alleviate air quality issues in cities in those developing countries. And the second half of my dissertation really focused on looking at climate action in cities in the US, and specifically looking at issues around carbon cap and trade in California, and how concerns around air pollution and environmental justice could be impact sort of how that policy is implemented and sort of how we can help alleviate pollution burdens on low-income and frontline communities through climate change action. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Fang. We're excited to have you here today as well. So first, like I said, we're going to start off with some of the questions that were submitted during the registration process. And these first set of questions that I'll be taking care of are kind of related to like policy and research frameworks. So the first thing that we want to start off with is oftentimes we hear things like climate justice and environmental justice and health disparities, but the definition, people sometimes have different definitions of them. And so I guess how, first starting off broadly, how would you define the intersection between climate change and health? And Dr. Mach, we'll start with you.
And Alicia, that question is kind of climate and health, but also thinking heavily about the environmental justice domains. Is that kind of how you see the point of interest there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, super. Okay, so there's so many different angles and things that weave together here. So first, kind of what is the intersection between climate change and health? I think Andrew's going to have a lot of richness here as well, from the air quality dimensions, the water features as well, and oftentimes kind of preparing for the impacts of a changing climate heavily intersects with our energy system, our transportation systems, our built environment right now at this nexus as well. So I guess I'll say I often am working on many different types of interconnections here. Certainly, whether it is heat and a changing climate. From an environmental justice angle, I think what is so striking is that heat is actually one of the most deadliest of climate hazards, whether it's the chronic burden, those working outdoors in the heat, those who can't afford continuous AC or don't have enough insulation in their building to stay cool. So heat is deadly, but it has been completely off the radar historically. And I think that really brings in a lot of these themes of climate justice, of whose issues have been noticed and have been counted in a policy context. When it comes to something like flooding or storms or disasters intensifying in a changing climate, again, there's this question of what is the distribution of impacts at present, but then there's also the really important question of who is benefiting most or at all from our processes of disaster relief and recovery. And then again, bringing in this feature of climate justice, environmental justice, there's been very uneven access to forms of disaster relief becoming whole again or nearly whole again in the aftermath of disaster. Who is displaced by a flood? Again, immense questions of environmental justice. I think from the kind of physiological or epidemiological side, there are many direct connections between climate change and health, whether it is the direct impacts of heat, waterborne disease, the way that air quality affects our cardiovascular systems, many different ways that the changing climate affects with human health and well-being, whether you define it narrowly or broadly. And then the last bit I would just add is that I do think from the angle of climate justice, it's really crucial to say who is exposed to hazards, what is the full distribution of impacts, what is the full distribution of risk. But next, kind of who's at the table and benefiting from current policies, and where policies are just advancing the status quo, where is that status quo inequitable in terms of how we are now dealing with climate impacts for health and well-being.
Okay, great, thank you. Dr. Fang, is there any additional notes that you would like to add to that, or?
Sure. I mean, heat that Dr. Mach just brought up is definitely something I think about. I think, you know, in my research, I more focus on air pollution and sort of what the inequities in terms of air pollution exposure might be, and sort of how climate change action could potentially alleviate those burdens. One thing I wanted to bring up was sort of how emissions are sort of more reliant on consumption of high income individuals in the US, whereas pollution burdens in the US are obviously felt more strongly with low income and marginalized groups. So that could be because the power plant's located close to a low income community. That could be because the highway is going through a marginalized community. That could be because industry or a port is located close to like a frontline or fence line community. And so all those communities feel a disproportionate pollution burden, even though they may not be the cause or be able to attribute that burden to their consumption patterns. I also think in my current role at USAID, we think about the ways in which climate finance and development finance flows to different countries and different communities as we try to tackle climate change. And so one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is sort of what are development co-benefits of climate change in terms of access to jobs, access to food, access to different infrastructure services that may be reliant on tackling climate change, and how health and well-being outcomes are tied to that climate finance and who we fund and what we fund in the countries that we work in. So, you know, I think you can both look at it from the damages side and who's feeling the disproportionate burden of pollution, and you can also think about it from the side of, you know, who's getting the benefits of taking climate action, and how does that impact sort of health and well-being outcomes. Thanks.
Great, thank you both. So yeah, so you both actually touched on another question on like some of the key disparities that you may observe, like talking about like income, access to food, access to clean water, right? Things like that. And so I guess like that next question is like sometimes in the discussion, there's sometimes like a lot of emphasis on like what individuals can do to alleviate these burdens, right? And that can be particularly problematic in some instances. So another question we have is like, what policies can the US enact that would actually shift the burden of this climate mitigation to corporations rather than individuals?
Andrew, would you like to start on that one, since I think there's a particular mitigation focus?
Sure. Yeah, when I initially think about that question, my first thought goes to cap and trade. Obviously, we see how cap and trade has influenced California's climate mitigation policy. I don't think it's politically feasible in much of the rest of the country. One thing that we have been hearing, you know, post-COP is about this carbon border adjustment mechanism function that is being proposed. I believe the EU is the initial proposer, but
And
essentially,
Dr. Fang, can you briefly define what you mean by cap and trade? Sorry.
Sure. I guess the idea that big producers or big emitters would have a certain limit on their CO2 emissions, and then a trading system that would allow those polluters to either mitigate their emissions or pay a certain premium for the ability to emit CO2 emissions globally.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the one reason I bring that up is both because that would force companies to measure their emissions because there's a fiscal penalty for having a high emitting product. And then I think the second thing to think about is, cap and trade will generate income due to some companies will feel that it's cheaper to pay the penalty than to mitigate their pollution. And that income can be redistributed to, different communities or different areas that are facing disproportionate pollution burdens. And so there's an income or wealth transfer from that system that could also benefit communities that would like to tackle climate change, but may not have the fiscal resources to do what they want to do.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm not sure there's too much for me to add, but I guess I would just add just a few brief things. I think in a way it kind of raises this question of what is the interaction between existing government policies on the climate issue and the role of the private sector. And I think, as many of you might be aware, the Paris Agreement structure is kind of an opt-in structure where countries are coming forward with pledges and ideally ratcheting up ambition through time as solutions become more widespread, more cost-effective. And I do think there's increasing attention to the very important role of corporations in stepping forward, at the same time that there is a realization that that means ensuring that pledges are robust, and especially if everyone's trying to offset their emissions, saying, I'm not going to take action, but I'll provide funds for reducing emissions elsewhere. There is a huge requirement for transparency, robust accounting, robust reporting, and a lot of that institutional infrastructure is emerging and is really important for making sure that what the atmosphere sees matches what we think is happening in terms of all the pledges and increasing policy ambition being put forth.
Okay, thank you both. Yes, and then another question about, I guess, like research frameworks and how exactly you go about assessing these impacts and these improvements. So what are some of the measures that you use to assess these impacts on like these frontline communities in your research, or whether or in policy, and maybe they intersect in some way? And Dr. Mach, if you would like to start with this one as well.
Yes, would love to jump in on this one. Many different entry points and angles. So I do a lot of work on the impacts of extreme heat and chronic heat exposure, impacts of flooding, and also to some degree wildfire. And to just give a feel for what that has looked like, for example, when it comes to flooding and sea level rise, being based in South Florida, there is acute attention to the ways that the rising waters through time will increasingly put pressure on the burden of flooding, not just during storm conditions, but when you're trying to drive to work, or when you're walking through puddles now, which are kind of basically increasingly filled with runoff from sewer in the landscape where there's a lot of septic. So what we're doing largely is very granular attention to flooding at the household scale. So not just what are the impacts for the county as a whole, or when you do that, usually historically, you're looking effectively at property damages. So you're in effect valuing high value properties more, and you're not even looking at damages beyond that, or sometimes there also can be a look at mortality in the aftermath of a disaster. But really saying, okay, we know the impacts of flooding are way more than just quote unquote property damages, and one where we need granular attention to the nature of who's experiencing these damages on a daily basis, in addition to storm conditions. So one is just kind of going as granular as we can on the side of flooding, and then pairing that with who is being affected by flooding. And in the Miami context, this is certainly the case for many different parts of the US. As Andrew described, it's a landscape where redlining existed historically. Who was displaced by the construction of the highway in South Florida? It was the Black community, as is the case in almost any US city that you look at. And this historic set of racist policies in the region actually resulted in the Black community in Miami currently being on high ground. Now, as the seas rise, what was previously the land that was viewed as undesirable, intertwined with racist policies, now suddenly looks more desirable to everyone because it's on high, safe ground. And so as the geography of risk is shifting, these intense questions of racism historically and in the current day now are directly relevant to climate policy as well. So bringing all of those themes together of who lives where, who's affected by the direct and the indirect impacts of a hazard like flooding, what that means for equitable policy moving forward, recognizing that if you just run with the status quo, it's going to be about development and dollars and existing power structure and the perpetuation of many of these dynamics that have been so potent to date. I could go into heat, that's probably a long enough example to start with.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Fang, if you had anything to add with how it happens, with what measures you may be using on like a policy level or like a government federal level, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, I think on the research side, given, my research is focused mainly on air pollution, I mean, I think the way in which we measure impacts on frontline or fence-line communities has really been sort of in terms of the mortality or morbidity impacts being felt from air pollution or, excessive amounts of air pollution. So, I mean, I think there's obviously a bunch of different resources and, a lot of scientific literature that has gone into understanding what the variability of those air quality impacts might be, depending on what sources are causing the air quality, what populations are experiencing that air quality, differences in, age, gender, minority or racial composition of the populations being impacted. So I think that's sort of the primary example that would come to mind. And I think, the way that plays out and sort of how we look at climate change mitigation, either what I'm doing at USAID or sort of what I was doing in my past work is which sources of climate change mitigation have impacts on, say, overall air quality versus which mitigation opportunities might have specific impacts on communities that have a disproportionate burden of air quality or excessive amounts of air quality. So for example, you might be able to achieve the same amount of climate change mitigation from shutting down a power plant versus electrifying vehicles in a neighborhood. And so shutting down that power plant may have implications for an entire city's or entire region's air quality, but electrifying vehicles or buses in a certain neighborhood may have a more localized impact and may reduce air pollution hotspots in a particular city or particular neighborhood. Thanks.
Sorry, on mute. And so now we will actually switch over to Jenny May Fine, who will moderate this section of the workshop in which these questions will focus kind of like on communication and collaboration with these frontline communities.
Hi, I'm just gonna chime in here, as Alicia said, to ask you some questions about science communication as well as collaboration amongst stakeholders. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your names correctly. So Dr. Mach and Dr. Fang, is that the correct pronunciation of your last names?
Correct for me, and you can also call me Katharine or Katie.
Okay.
Yes, Andrew is fine for me.
Okay, and I'm Jenny. So thank you for that. The first question I would like to ask you is, how do you recommend incorporating environmental justice into science research and communication, specifically for academics? And either one of you can go first.
Andrew, do you want to go first?
I was going to let you go first, given that I'm not exactly in the academic space now, but I'll come up with an answer in a sec.
Okay. I was thinking you'd have a fresh perspective on what universities should be doing. Yeah, okay, so this is a question I think about a lot. So where to start? I mean, I guess I'd say, first of all, I think as academics, it's really crucial that we be thinking about what's happening on our campuses. I'll get into research for society, but I think the first place to start is to recognize that universities historically have, basically been colonial and racist in many of the implicit assumptions that have been deployed, and that pertains to who is attending the university, who is faculty, and then what are their experiences. These broader themes of, as universities move to become more reflective of the population in the US and international communities as well, we're now at a new challenge of oftentimes the experiences on campus still not being equal and outcomes post-graduation still not being equal. So I, as an academic, feel that that's a crucial place to start, and I think really hard about ensuring a community with the students I work with where they come from many different backgrounds, have many different experiences, and we care really deeply about one another and push towards vibrant interactions for everyone. And that requires feedback processes. It requires really attending to many different dimensions of the academic experience. Then I would say that certainly stepping into the research realm, there are different ways to ask questions. And maybe I'll just give a specific example. So before moving to the University of Miami, I was based at Stanford University for quite a long time, starting as a student and then working for the IPCC and then as a senior research scientist. And we did a lot of research on California climate policy, a little bit in the space of adaptation, but also a lot related to the offset programs, as well as some of the policies unfolding. And, one basic take home would be, are you paying attention to what the state as a whole is experiencing in aggregate? So emissions reductions through electric vehicles overall, or are you simultaneously monitoring the distribution of outcomes and who is experiencing benefits versus who is experiencing harms? And so really running with one of the examples that Andrew was highlighting, even in the state of California, which has been really ambitious with electric vehicles, it has been whiter, wealthier communities that have adopted electric vehicles with rebates supported by state policies. But in terms of where polluting EGUs, electric generation units, basically power plants, are sited in the state right now, they are co-located with communities of color for the most part due to historic practices of redlining. So something like electrifying the vehicle fleet in the state of California actually is serving to redistribute emissions from cleaning up the whiter, wealthier neighborhoods and redistributing pollution to the places where power plants exist into communities of color and lower income communities. So that's just kind of an example of basically saying, let's look at the distribution of outcomes, not just the average value. And you often see a very different experience intersecting with, the nature of the processes, the procedures, the degree to which there's recognition of a lot of these dynamics that exist historically. So I think both in terms of kind of the topics of research, but then also how the research is pursued, there is truly a vast amount there when it comes to being attentive to environmental justice and ethics in the space of research, as well as the space of campuses more broadly.
Thank you, Kathy, for your response to that. And I'm glad you also touched a little bit on what academics can do also in addressing this issue. And Andrew, maybe if you feel comfortable with the next question, taking on that one. So if not, it's okay, you can pass the baton. What are some of the things that people often get wrong when talking about climate change and their impact on frontline communities?
Sure. I can tackle that and maybe use my answer to sort of circle back a bit as well. So I think one of the things I highlighted in terms of how we talk about climate change impacts on frontline communities is, exactly which impacts are sort of unequally felt is something that's not always well defined. So in my research on, air pollution and co-benefits, a lot of my work focuses on what are the damages being felt by communities in terms of disproportionate health impacts. I think another way to look at that same issue is sort of on what the resilience of the communities being impacted is. And so what are the current access to health services or underlying health conditions in the communities that may be being impacted by disproportionate levels of air pollution. And then I think circling back to a previous point I made, then the question would be, if you want to alleviate air pollution that's being felt by these frontline communities, how do you make sure that climate finance or climate mitigation funding in general is flowing to areas that could, use increased job access, increased access to clean transportation solutions, increased access to jobs. And so I think depending on which lens you take, you could be looking at a very different set of inequality metrics. And depending on what your research question or focus area is, would probably change sort of exactly what methods you use to analyze those inequalities. Just circling back to the last question, I guess I'd say, maybe broadening a little bit beyond environmental justice. I mean, I think there's a need for the academic community to rethink sort of how community engaged research is done. And so I think in terms of how we train our PhD and doctoral students, I mean, community engaged research is not something that's necessarily always in the curriculum. And so I think, I would advocate for research that's, by the community, for the community, and with the community. And so I think that both speaks to sort of, who the faculty and PhD candidates are, like what their representation is, what their income or minority or racial background might be, and sort of how they can reflectively interact with some of these frontline communities. Depending on who's doing the research, obviously you'd get a different response or different level of engagement from the frontline communities that you might be interacting with. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andrew, for adding on to the previous question and also Kathy's comments about how to include academics and bridge the gap within science communication there. And this next question, whoever would like to go first, please feel free to chime in. We know that climate change comes with a lot of sub-issues. So in your opinion, what is the most pressing immediate need or issue that must be addressed?
Okay, I wish I could boil it down to one, but I guess I have three maybe. So, I mean, I do think a place where I would start is that when it comes to the impacts of a changing climate, there is huge social construction of the damages, right? So this is not something where the climate is changing, it's out of our control, and these are kind of like acts of God being wrought upon people in the space of natural hazards. Really, instead, whether we can handle heat or be damaged by heat or flooding or fire or drought really comes down to the nature of the policies we have in place, our levels of preparedness, our systems of disaster recovery and relief, the state of our infrastructure, the state of our built environment. The list is very long. So I think kind of just recognizing deeply that we have huge agency over the nature of the impacts that occur is phenomenally important, and something that kind of sometimes is bizarrely forgotten in saying, oh no, we have a drought. Oh well, this is something that is outside of our control, but really flipping it and saying, actually, there is a huge role for government, for policy, for community action to reduce damages. I think that the two other things I would slide in, even though it's only supposed to be a single most pressing need, would be number one, the connection between what we're doing now and options in the longer term, and really thinking hard about that interconnect. What pathways are we opening versus what pathways are we closing off? And then the third that I would emphasize is kind of the distribution of impacts, how that intersects with who's at the table, who's participating, who has voice, power, influence, the points that Andrew was raising in the space of community-based research, but also for policy and responses more broadly.
I guess on my side, I'd put my development hat on for a sec. And so I think one of the things to think about with climate change is also the resources that are being mobilized either on the adaptation side or the mitigation side to address climate change issues. I think especially in developing countries, given that most of these countries haven't, historically been big emitters, there's a tendency to think, why do we need to take action that may preclude development benefits because clean energy or other solutions to climate change may be more costly. I think maybe turning that question on its head and saying what are the economic opportunities from the flows of climate finance to address adaptation and mitigation is something that I think it's an open question for us as a development agency. I think specifically going to transportation solutions, which I've been working on more closely recently, I think one of our big questions is sort of, if we fund decarbonization of transportation in a given country, how do we make sure that those that finance is not only flowing to the highest income individuals in the countries we work in? So that goes into both access to, say, private electric vehicles, that goes into addressing public transit, non-motorized forms of travel, and ways in which we can make sure that everyone has access to clean transportation and sort of the benefits of that transition don't get concentrated in high-income individuals in the countries we work in.
Thank you both for responding to that. And I'm sure this topic is going to come up with our participants today later on, as well as maybe tomorrow's workshop. I'm going to pass the next set of questions over to Shay. So she will address questions about society and ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone, and a special hello to our panelists. I'm so happy to have you join us today. So as Jenny stated, I have the pleasure of asking questions regarding society and ethics. So the first question I want to ask is, what suggestions do you have for someone who identifies as being a white, Western-trained female scientist for going about building partnerships with indigenous people and racial minorities to address climate change with an environmental justice lens?
Super question. Andrew, would you like to start on this one?
Sure, I'm sure you have really interesting perspective given that I'm not a white Western trained female scientist. But the things that came to mind initially for me were to be reflexive. I think, given the question, I think this person is already thinking reflexively about sort of what their own unconscious biases or blind spots might be. I do think, given that upbringing or background will be very different from the communities that they're attempting to work with, I think a key step would be to engage with a local NGO or local group that has familiarity with how to engage with the community in question. I think, for USAID specifically, I think we're all trying to figure out ways in which we can, encourage our implementers to work with local partners and make sure that whatever programs we're implementing are really taking into account either a community or civil society organization that has experience with the specific country context in which we're working. And then I think the last thing I would say is find a way to make sure the research leaves something to benefit the community. And so I think historically, a lot of academics have worked with a marginalized group and produced research and gotten a lot of notoriety or fame for that research. But the community itself hasn't necessarily felt the benefits of that research. And so I think it's important to think up front about ways in which this research could leave something in the community that would have a positive impact long term.
Super. And yeah, thank you, Shay, for raising that question from the audience. And it seems appropriate for me to take it on as someone who identifies as a white, Western trained female scientist. It certainly is a question I have thought about a whole lot. I totally agree with everything Andrew emphasized. So, first of all, I think just recognizing that there is a long history of academics and researchers doing wrong, as Andrew described, and that can be deliberate and gross, and why ethical training for researchers exists, or it can be sometimes subtle and accidental, but ultimately not all that surprising. And I think being very aware of those dimensions is absolutely critical. So what are some of the best practices that have emerged? I'm part of a group called the Science of Actionable Knowledge. I think it might be somewhat similar to this network in a way. And what we've been working with researchers and practitioners is kind of, to boil down some of the existing lessons learned, but also kind of practices that should be deployed across many different contexts. So number one, long-term relationships. If you're helicoptering in and out for a chapter in your dissertation, usually that's not going to go very well unless it is pursued through, as Andrew described, existing relationships, existing partnerships. I have many students in my group, most of whom are not white female scientists, who have deep passion about community-based research, engaged research. And what we often do project by project is really say, how can they partner in a way with community organizations or local governments or tribes, such that they are adding to existing work and understanding what questions do people have, how could that benefit them, not just kind of saying, I have a project, do you want to participate, but really saying, do you have a project where I could help, and really kind of rethinking the nature of the relationship from square one. So that's the first one. Got to be long-term partnerships. That's trickier for students, but I think it can be done with a lot of reflexivity, as Andrew described, and intentionality about it. Next, I would say that there's absolutely an imperative of understanding the experiences of everyone engaged in a research project throughout. So understanding, what does someone value as the type of relationship they want in the research process, the questions they're interested in, what it means from everyone's perspective for this to be a meaningful relationship. If it is something where it is just the academics who are saying that went great, you've got a problem, right? That it really needs to be something where all perspectives are explicitly considered throughout the whole process. And then thank you, Jenny, for dropping in that special, I'm guessing that might be the special issue as a whole. One of the sets of papers there was also to really kind of explicitly say, what does it mean to decolonize the research process, to be anti-colonial and anti-racist in the research process, and really kind of not just making room for Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, but kind of reframing and kind of a moving over of the academic starting point, and really kind of a leveling of the playing field in a proactive sense. So I think all of those are incredibly important. And I guess most crucially, not being naive about the seriousness with which these issues must be pursued.
Awesome. Thank you both for your perspective. Yeah, I totally agree. The institution where I received my graduate degree, we really was focused on health equity. And part of what you stated, Katie, is establishing those long-term relationships, because there's a mistrust, which is rightly so, but learning how to kind of overcome some of those challenges so we can kind of improve health outcomes, and so we can be a healthier nation, because if we're all healthy, then we'll be a healthier nation. The next question, which either you can kind of take a grab at it, is, what are some of the biggest challenges or barriers for integrating environmental justice into climate science?
Another great question. Andrew, do you want to kick off on this one?
Sure. I don't know if I have a great answer to this. I guess I would say the first thing that came to mind is, I guess a lot of times when I deal with environmental justice issues, or I deal with air quality, air pollution issues, I'm really dealing with damages or harms or health impacts that are very local. And I think there's sort of this tension there between, obviously we acknowledge climate change is a global issue, it requires collective action, ideally a lot of international cooperation. And so there's sometimes a disconnect between sort of the damages that we're trying to measure and sort of the action or the advocacy that we're trying to promote on an international level. I think specifically when I think about our work with USAID, when we think about justice or climate justice, so, sometimes we're thinking about different measures of fairness or different impacts on, say, gender versus income versus race and how that might be felt differently. I think a lot of the climate justice conversation, for example, has been focused on sort of inequalities and sort of age and sort of how young people are going to be feeling a disproportionate burden from climate impacts, although a lot of the decisions are being made by people who may not be alive when all these big climate change impacts are felt. So, I mean, I think it's important to define, which type of equity you're really pursuing in order to sort of differentiate between what challenge or what justice challenge you're trying to address with your action on climate.
Super, and I'll just add a few other things that come to mind. I think first of all, a lot of the climate sciences have historically originated strongly in the natural sciences, physics, math, different dimensions of how the physical environment is changing. And I often have found that kind of like battle number one in introducing environmental justice is actually kind of just providing this profound reminder that this is not just about the physical climate. These issues are strongly socially constructed, shaping who experiences what impacts, who is benefiting from our responses, the degree to which the role of human history, not just geologic history, is crucially important to these issues. Another related issue is kind of how research is funded within the US or internationally. I'm obviously more familiar with the details of our funding for research in the United States. And historically, there hasn't been that much bandwidth for community-driven research in the space of the climate sciences. I would say, though, that in some very hopeful ways that is changing and changing quite rapidly, whether it's the ways in which the National Science Foundation or NIH, or even some of the newly available FEMA and BRIC funding, starting to rethink how you have partnerships that aren't putting academics first and community second in the funding of research that is supposed to be about advancing social justice in the climate context. The third thing I would emphasize, and this kind of comes back to some of the themes that Andrew emphasized as well, this kind of, where we have data on, who is experiencing air pollution or pollution of the water or contamination of the soil or heat impacts household by household, or waters on the rising tide carrying pollutants if it's on top of a septic system or on top of a Superfund site. Oftentimes we have massive data gaps that are more a function of environmental justice concerns as compared to our scientific capabilities. So even where do we have insight on what the nature of the burdens are, carries themes of environmental justice relevant to the science. And so kind of getting to a place where you can even point to quantitatively what the nature of the disparities are requires an environmental justice mindset in the collection of data and the maintenance of these data sets as well.
Wow, you guys, those were awesome answers. And actually, you kind of touched on answer from the last question that I have. I'll just mention it, but Katie, especially you, are there any fundamental shifts that you foresee society having to undergo to combat climate change? And if so, what are they? But you kind of like touched on some of them. So I don't know if you want to expand upon them, or Andrew, you want to add something to that question?
Andrew, you want to jump in first?
Sure. I mean, two things there. I mean, I think on the energy side of things, I think we're undergoing a huge clean energy transition, not only decarbonizing the grid, but also digitalizing the grid and also making it more distributed. So energy is not concentrated or it's not generated in really big, huge plants, but there's a lot of producers of energy, especially if you have distributed solar or other distributed energy sources. So that's a big shift that has implications both for climate and energy sector more broadly. I think the other thing that we've been working on as an agency is circular economy issues. And so when we think about shifting to clean energy, obviously we have huge amounts of critical minerals needed for solar panels, wind, and battery storage. And so making sure that we're not polluting different areas where these minerals are developed or utilized, and sort of shifting the burden of pollution from where the power plant is to where the critical minerals might be mined is another issue that is sort of emerging and is probably going to require a big transition over the next 20 to 30 years as we make this clean energy shift.
Great. And I guess just one last piece I would add on to that would be, whether it's the mitigation challenge of, shifting to a world where we aren't putting heat trapping gases into the atmosphere in our energy transport and land use systems, or whether it's dealing with the impacts of a changing climate. In both of those spheres, we unfortunately kind of have to grapple with some of the biggest drivers of how societies have developed thus far. And some of it, you could say, well, this is just an engineering challenge. We just need to swap out our systems of transport and electricity generation. And that is the easier entry point. But oftentimes in terms of why that gets so difficult so quickly, kind of the power, the politics, the equity dimensions of it, is that whether it's our energy systems globally, our land use systems globally, or kind of the way that we have developed, oftentimes these are radically bound up with basically processes of wealth accumulation that have benefited some people and not others. And so kind of transitioning towards a system where all people are prepared for the impacts that are inevitable at this point, and where we're not reliant on heat trapping emissions to go about our daily lives, really requires grappling with the fact that our land use policies, where we have put people and houses and who is in high quality, affordable housing right now versus not, those dynamics are strongly bound up with inequity in society, as well as some of these similar themes for energy. And that plays out globally as well as domestically within and across countries. And so oftentimes kind of why this gets so structural so quickly is that, in fact, our economies are bound up with the climate challenge, and our economies have not been equitable to date.
Awesome, great answers. I really enjoyed hearing you guys kind of, give your intake on these questions. Now I will turn it back over to Alicia, and she'll facilitate the rest of this portion of the workshop. Thank you again.
Okay. All right. So a lot of great things have been said here today. And before we enter the breakout rooms, we also wanted to give people an opportunity to just ask questions that you can put them in the chat that may have come up or may have been triggered by some of the information that's been given today. So if any participants or co-hosts do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat.
We could probably try to entertain any question that anyone has. So feel free to toss in anything to the chat or speak up.
For sure.
Well, this is Shay. I'll ask a question because I was really interested in the questions I asked. What, if any, and this is, I guess, your own thoughts, what role do our political party play in helping to control climate change? And I ask this because we've known from different administration, there's been a lot of like, oh, climate change is not a thing. It is a thing, but do they play a role or integral role or role at all? And not just at the federal level, because we have so many governing bodies. Do they play a role in helping to kind of address this climate control issue? Because my fear is that it gets politicized, right? So now that's where we are. But we're still having these extreme temperatures and just weird and unusual weather. So just kind of want to get your intake on, do you believe they play a role in helping to address this problem?
Good question. Andrew, you want to go first, or?
I don't know that I have a great answer to the question. Obviously, certain parties are more willing to tackle climate change than others. I think the one thing to think about is if you think about the communities that are feeling climate change impacts, like, for example, the winter storms we had in Texas last year. I mean, those are sort of agnostic in terms of which political party you're affiliated with. And so addressing the impacts of climate change, I think, is pretty apolitical. I would say in terms of how we look at mitigation and how people approach solutions to climate change and mitigation, I think that sometimes gets a lot more political. And I think that goes into Katie's previous answer on sort of how our economic structures are formed to sort of accumulate wealth in certain individuals. But I do think, at least, as USAID has tried to tackle climate change, I think there are certain messages that cross party lines in terms of, say, promoting clean energy for affordability or reliability or diversity of energy resources. I think there's certain messages that are co-benefits of addressing climate that are sort of apolitical and can cross administrations.
Yeah, great. And I really appreciate this question, because I think the degree to which in many US contexts, the climate issue is political, at least for me personally, like, it's stressful, right? It makes it a very high intensity issue in so many different contexts. And this might be something that Andrew's seen, but for me, one thing kind of early in my career that was very uplifting was working internationally on the climate issue and recognizing that the intense polarization of the climate issue in the US does not exist everywhere. It tends to be kind of a feature of the more Anglo countries of the world. The US, Australia, Canada have these kind of also kind of crazy dynamics around climate denial. So go figure. But I think for me, that was just kind of actually a beautiful thing to realize that, in the international negotiations with the IPCC, you've got over 195 countries, 50 countries from Africa, 50 countries from Asia, basically close to 50 small island developing states. And it is a very different tenor in terms of the seriousness and the perceptions of the current day challenges of the climate issue. I guess another hopeful entry point for me has actually been realizing that when there's community recognition of a challenge, oftentimes that's when kind of some of the intense politics can fall away. Recognition that this is something where it's imperative that people come together, and that this, as Andrew described so eloquently, can be about co-benefits and a better future, and not just something that is kind of an undesirable forced transition, so to speak. And then I also think there's this immense requirement for responsibility and a recognition of who is benefited from emissions of heat trapping gases, as well as other forms of pollution historically, and what it means to ensure that everyone benefits moving forward, and where that requires kind of actively countering a lot of these past practices.
Thank you both. Really great answers.
Alrighty, and we have a lot of great questions in the chat. So we will try to get through these as much as possible. The first question is about in general careers. So like for someone who is interested in getting into working with environmental justice and impacts of it, is there a way to do this that does not require graduate school, or do most of these careers require further education? And I guess like more broadly, how would you recommend people getting involved on like a grassroots and community-based levels as well?
Great. So I guess I can just start here briefly and then pass to you, Andrew. Does that seem good? Yeah. So I would say that in my experience, many climate relevant jobs, whether it's with community orgs or local government or state government, are very amenable to people graduating with an undergraduate degree or a master's degree. And frankly, unless you want to get really serious about detailed science, oftentimes a PhD is not required for many climate relevant jobs. So what I often encourage students to do is, first of all, get yourself on as many NGO or government relevant job lists as you possibly can. Keep your eye out for them. And then often kind of directly reaching out if there is a community organization or an NGO or an Office of Resilience or Climate Action that you are interested in working with, directly connecting with someone, asking for 20 minutes of their time, being very prepared for that networking interview and going from there. I have often found that undergraduates, if they are ambitious and proactive after graduating, are often able to get an entry-level job. And there's kind of nothing like working for a few years to really have a sense of whether you are passionate about this and do have a graduate degree that would make sense for you. What I recommend that people do not do is say like, oh, I need a really advanced degree immediately, because oftentimes if you try to jump straight to a PhD, say, you might really have no idea about what you would really want to study for a long-term sense as well. So for, I think, the person who asked this question, feel free to reach out by email as well. But I think being proactive in assessing your options often can go very far.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, obviously I pursued a PhD, so I didn't really take a track where I did not pursue an advanced degree. I think focusing on organizations that are active locally, whether that be civil society, NGO, or whether that be public service, like in terms of your local government, I think a lot of those organizations aren't necessarily looking for like a highly, PhD trained scientist to assist them. I think a lot of them are short staffed. And so whether you do some sort of volunteer work during your degree or whether you do an internship after you graduate, I mean, I think a lot of those organizations are looking to find individuals with a certain competency and skill set that may not be necessarily like a PhD trained scientist to help them achieve their advocacy or environmental justice goals. And so I think finding an organization to volunteer with or get experience with will open the door to a lot of other similarly minded organizations that could use that skill set.
Awesome. Thank you both. And that is actually a really good point. I think sometimes there's a misconception that it's like, I need the highest degree possible, but there's so many other ways to gain that valuable experience as well. I'm going to ask a few more questions and then we'll go into the breakout rooms. So to kind of just keep the flow, I'm going to ask Nora's question because their question is related to local mitigation efforts, so which were just kind of brought up, and then I'll jump back up to Allie's question. So Nora is asking, are local mitigation efforts enough to create impact on tackling climate change? And what do we do when we don't have adequate national leadership or international collaborators or collaborations?
Andrew, this one is a little bit more in your wheelhouse. I don't know if you're eager to jump in first.
Sure. I think the initial thing to say there is, I think in the US, climate leadership hasn't necessarily been at the national level, say over the past 5 years or so. I think you see a lot of cities and, local leaders taking on the challenge of climate, whether it's for political gain or financial gain. They may not have specific environmental objectives, but they may look at it as an opportunity to attract business or corporations or finance if they show that they're taking a leadership role in the issue. So I don't think national leadership is necessarily a prerequisite for cities taking action. That being said, if you look at what cities have in terms of their jurisdictional power, a lot of them may have limits on the systems or the processes which they can impact. And so, if I just think about the energy space, a lot of cities can have impact on, say, local transportation efforts. They can have impacts on building codes, but they still need access to financial resources to implement the policies. And they also need, multi-level governance or support from state and federal authorities to influence, say, where the energy generation is coming from. And so I think there's a limit to what cities or local organizations can do, but a lot of them have taken a leadership role. And so I will say, over 50% of the population globally lives in cities. And so I think there is a lot of work that can be done at the local level in the absence of national leadership.
Great.
I totally agree with everything Andrew said. You can't go the full way with local level action. However, more different pressures on the system, recognizing that this is about all levels of government, all regions of the world, the public sector, the private sector, creating models of progress has a lot of influence, oftentimes in just kind of demonstrating that this can be very exciting, very empowering, and something where why not? The federal government should be taking action if all the local jurisdictions are pushing in that direction.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. And so one last question, and then we'll move on into the breakout rooms. And if I was not able to get to your question, you are definitely more than welcome to bring this back up when we are within the breakout rooms as well. So don't think that this is your last chance or that you're not going to get the information that you seek. Our one last question that we have, so this comes from Ali Berry. How would implementing the Gender Equity Index impact the equitable distribution of climate finances internationally?
So I'm not familiar with the Gender Equity Index. Ali, could you maybe come off mute and describe a little bit further what the question entails?
Yeah, so in previous classes that I've taken regarding environmental studies, we've talked about the failures that GDP has when we think about what investments we're making internationally and what strides are being pulled towards climate justice. And then we also talk a lot about how infant mortality rates and gender equality can measure how we're making progress in those countries. So what I'm really interested about with the Gender Equity Index is if we are measuring success by equity, are we able to more efficiently and are we able to more efficiently determine if our actions are effective?
Sure. So I definitely think measuring effectiveness is a key challenge, regardless if it's a public sector, private sector donor internationally. I think, just without too much familiarity in the index, I will say JESI, gender equity, social inclusion, is a big push at the agency. And I think historically we've had gender requirements in terms of how we measure impact of our different programs. But I think more and more the question is how you can integrate these principles into the core mission of the programs to make sure that gender and equity and social inclusion are not sort of just check the box exercises for the people we work with who are implementing programming internationally. So I think the index seems like a neat way to sort of measure the impact of climate finance. I don't think there's a huge amount of transparency in terms of where climate finance is going and how those decisions are being made currently. And so I think anything we can do to sort of measure how that is being attributed or how that's being distributed, the better for distribution of climate finance.
And in a funny way, I think this connects with the point I was raising earlier as well, where you could say in some dimensions, there's been a disproportionate focus on GDP as the one measure of well-being. Clearly, it is flawed. Similarly, in terms of disaster damages and climate impacts, oftentimes there's been this disproportionate emphasis on monetary damages. And I think just to add one last point here, if you narrowly define your view of impacts and benefits, you're going to miss a lot of these dimensions of, as Andrew described, gender equity, equity much more broadly, racially, ethnically, who's been marginalized across different communities globally. And I think kind of moving forward, not just in terms of the box checking as Andrew described, but deep incorporation requires a nuanced consideration of more holistic understandings of human well-being and health.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. So For this next portion, we're going to put you into breakout rooms. So during that registration process, you may have selected which room you prefer to be in. And so, yes, you'll have a notification come up on the screen here. And if you could join, that would be great. So now I'll open all of the rooms.